The U.S. power grid is like a giant game of Jenga. Every block is shaky. Every move makes it weaker, and sooner or later the whole tower comes crashing down. Most Americans don't realize it, but the wires above your head and the substations humming on the edge of town are relics from the 1960s and 70s, patched together with duct tape fixes while demand explodes like never before. Data centers, electric vehicles, non-stop air conditioning, all of it is pulling more juice than the system was ever designed to deliver. And here's the scary part. It only takes one extreme storm, one cyber attack, or one equipment failure to tip entire regions into weeks of darkness. We're talking no water, no gas, no hospitals, no safety net. Survival becomes primitive in less than 72 hours. But make no mistake, some states are dangling closer to that cliff than others. These are the places where infrastructure is crumbling, demand is skyrocketing, and one wrong move could plunge millions into chaos. Today we're counting down 10 U.S. states on the very edge of blackouts. If your home shows up on this list, the time to prepare isn't tomorrow. It's right now, because when the grid goes down it won't just be an inconvenience, it will be the fight of your life. Number 10. Nevada. Nevada is more than casinos and neon lights. It's a state teetering on the edge of grid collapse every summer. Why? Because Nevada is a desert state pretending it has the power reserves of the Midwest. In reality, the Silver State is heavily dependent on imports, especially from California and Arizona, which means when their neighbors falter, Nevada gets cut off first. According to the Energy Information Administration, Nevada's summer peak demand is forecasted to rise by nearly 25% in the next decade, but the state's reserve margins have shrunk dangerously thin since 2020. Las Vegas alone consumes over 5,600 megawatts on peak summer days, and the city is notoriously vulnerable because it depends on just a handful of high-voltage transmission corridors. Lose one, and the strip goes black. And let's not forget, Nevada is ground zero for climate extremes. The heat dome of 2023 saw Las Vegas temperatures sit at 117 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 days straight, during which NV Energy begged residents to cut back AC or face rolling outages. Then there's the Hoover Dam problem. Hydropower output, once Nevada's safety net, has fallen by nearly 30% thanks to Lake Mead's historic lows. That's megawatts gone, permanently, and when the grid flickers out in Nevada, the stakes are lethal. Casinos switch to emergency diesel that lasts only hours, while hospitals in Reno and Vegas have warned of potential evacuation scenarios if outages stretch beyond 72 hours. The desert doesn't forgive. When power vanishes in Nevada, it's not an inconvenience, it's survival roulette. Number 9. Kentucky. Kentucky is coal country, or at least it used to be. The state has retired nearly a dozen coal plants since 2015, slashing its dependable baseload generation just as demand surges. The irony: Kentucky still ranks among the top 10 coal-producing states, but instead of fueling its own grid, much of that coal is shipped out. That leaves locals dependent on a fragile mix of natural gas and aging infrastructure. In December 2022, during Winter Storm Elliott, parts of Kentucky lost power for days as natural gas pipelines froze solid. At the same time, power lines snapped under ice buildup, plunging tens of thousands into freezing darkness. Louisville Gas and Electric admitted their system came dangerously close to mandatory rolling outages. And here's what most people don't know. Kentucky's rural makeup makes restoration painfully slow. Nearly 40% of residents live outside metro areas, meaning utility crews are stretched thin over miles of isolated lines. The result? Blackouts in Kentucky last longer than the national average, 6.5 hours per event compared to the U.S. average of 2. Kentucky's infrastructure is aging too. Many transformers were installed in the 1970s and are decades past replacement. Lead times for new units now stretch 12-18 months, meaning one major failure could leave the state limping for years. Add to this the growing frequency of extreme weather, flash floods in summer, polar vortexes in winter, and you've got a grid one step away from collapse in every season. Kentucky's slogan should be rewritten. It's not unbridled spirit, Its unstable power. Number 8. Colorado. Colorado looks pristine from the outside. Snow-capped mountains, booming tech hubs like Denver, endless solar potential. But behind that postcard image lies a grid under siege. Why? Because Colorado is in the middle of a dangerous transition. Nearly 40% of its coal plants are scheduled for retirement by 2030, but replacement projects, wind farms, solar and limited gas facilities, are years behind schedule. That's left a widening reliability gap. The state's peak demand surged past 13,000 megawatts in 2023, and reserve margins are shrinking every year. The Colorado Public Utilities Commission has warned that prolonged heat waves or winter freezes could push the state into rolling blackouts as soon as 2025. Denver itself is a ticking time bomb. Nearly 3 million people live in the metro, packed into high-altitude towers that depend on constant pumping stations for water and HVAC systems for survival. In 2021, the Marshall Fire proved just how vulnerable the system is. Power lines sparked one of the most destructive wildfires in state history, and utilities cut power to entire counties to prevent further disasters. Hydropower, once Colorado's reliable backup, has dropped by nearly 20% as snowpack melts earlier each spring, leaving less water during peak summer demand. And here's the wild card: Colorado sits on the front lines of cyber warfare. The National Renewable Energy Lab in Golden is a prime target, meaning any grid attack here isn't just about local outages. It could cripple national energy research and defense projects. Colorado is marketed as colorful, but when the lights go out, it's nothing but cold, dark, and deadly. Number 7. Georgia. Georgia is booming. Atlanta alone adds tens of thousands of new residents a year, but its power grid isn't keeping up. Georgia Power, the state's largest utility, admitted in its 2024 Integrated Resource Plan that reserve margins are under severe pressure, especially during summer peaks. Atlanta's peak demand crossed 18,000 megawatts last July, pushing the system into what operators call dangerous territory. The problem? Over-reliance on natural gas. Nearly 50% of Georgia's electricity comes from gas-fired plants, and those pipelines are vulnerable to both freezing and cyberattack. During Winter Storm Elliott in 2022, gas pressure dropped so low that multiple power plants tripped offline just as demand surged. And let's not forget hurricanes. Georgia may not take direct hits like Florida, but storms barreling up the coast routinely shred transmission lines and flood substations. Savannah was dark for days after Hurricane Matthew in 2016, and utilities admit coastal infrastructure is still exposed. Meanwhile, Atlanta's skyscrapers and data centers are sucking up more power than ever. Georgia has become a major hub for tech, with massive new data farms requiring round-the-clock cooling. These facilities run on backup diesel, but only for days at a time. If Georgia's grid collapses in peak summer, the consequences go national. Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, the busiest in the world, would grind to a halt. Supply chains would choke instantly. And here's the kicker: the new Vogtle nuclear units, which were supposed to be Georgia's savior, are already billions over budget and years delayed. Translation? Georgia's grid is stretched thin, its backups aren't ready, and its risks are growing every season. Number 6. Oregon. Oregon might look safe from the outside: cool climate, heavy rainfall, abundant hydro, but insiders know it's one of the most fragile states in the Northwest. Why? Because Oregon depends on hydropower for over 40% of its generation, and that river lifeline is dying. Snowpack in the Cascades has declined nearly 25% since the 1980s, which means summer flows in the Columbia River are drying up just as peak demand soars. In 2023, Bonneville Power Administration reported hydro output was down 18%, forcing utilities to scramble for costly imports from California and Idaho. But imports are no guarantee. If California falters, Oregon is cut off. And wildfires add a brutal new layer. In 2020, the Labor Day fires destroyed transmission lines and forced utilities like Portland General Electric to preemptively shut off power to over 30,000 customers. This public safety power shutoff model is now routine, meaning tens of thousands lose electricity at the very moment they're fleeing firestorms. Add in Portland's explosive growth, the metro now tops 2.5 million people, and you've got a grid stretched beyond its design limits. Hospitals along the I-5 corridor admit their backup systems aren't built for prolonged outages. Rural Oregon fares even worse. Communities in the Cascades and eastern desert regions often wait days, even weeks, for restoration after storms. And here's the nightmare scenario: Oregon's seismic risk. The Cascadia subduction zone is overdue for a 9.0 earthquake, and grid planners admit such a quake would annihilate power infrastructure statewide. Oregon isn't just on the edge of blackouts, it's on the edge of collapse. Number 5. Virginia. Virginia sits at the crossroads of America's East Coast grid, but that position is exactly why it's so fragile. The state is now the global capital of data centers. Over 70% of the world's internet traffic flows through Northern Virginia's servers. That means an unprecedented concentration of power demand in a single region. Dominion Energy admitted in its 2024 reliability plan that peak demand in Northern Virginia could exceed available supply by over 3,000 megawatts within the decade. That's not a gap, that's a canyon. Meanwhile, Virginia's generation fleet is caught in limbo. Coal is shutting down, nuclear expansion is stalled, and offshore wind projects are years behind schedule. Natural gas pipelines face constant environmental lawsuits, meaning supply isn't guaranteed during polar vortex events. And here's the nightmare: if Northern Virginia blacks out, you don't just lose lights, you lose the internet. Amazon, Google, Microsoft, their server farms all sit in Loudoun County, nicknamed Data Center Alley. A prolonged outage here would cripple global financial systems, social media, cloud computing, and even U.S. military communications. In 2022, Winter Storm Elliott nearly pushed Virginia into rolling outages as PJM scrambled to meet demand across its 13-state footprint. Hospitals in Richmond and Norfolk reported near failures in backup systems, while coastal flooding threatened substations with every major storm. And don't forget, Virginia's proximity to Washington, D.C. makes it a prime cyber and physical attack target. A strike here wouldn't just darken homes, it would paralyze the nation's capital. Virginians should understand this: when the lights go out in Virginia, the whole world feels it. Number 4. Washington. Washington loves to brag about being the clean energy capital of America, but behind the green headlines lies a grid that's anything but bulletproof. Yes, over 60% of Washington's electricity comes from hydropower, but that's the Achilles heel. The Columbia River system is drying up. Snowpack in the Cascades has dropped by nearly a third in some regions since the 1980s, meaning summer hydro output is collapsing just when demand peaks. In 2023, the Bonneville Power Administration admitted that hydropower production was down 20%, forcing the state to rely on natural gas and imports, and those imports vanish when California and Oregon hit their own crises. Seattle itself is a ticking time bomb. Nearly 4 million people in the metro area live in dense high-rises that depend on constant pumping for water and HVAC. One prolonged blackout, and you've got tens of thousands trapped in overheated or frozen towers. And here's the darker truth: Washington sits right on the Cascadia subduction zone, one of the most dangerous fault lines in the world. FEMA's own models predict that a 9.0 earthquake would obliterate the grid, leaving millions powerless for months, not days. Hospitals in Seattle admit their diesel backups only last 72 hours, and refueling them after a quake would be nearly impossible. Add to that cyber risks. Remember, Washington hosts tech giants like Microsoft and Amazon, making it a prime target for foreign cyber attacks. If Washington falls, it's not just a local blackout, it's a collapse of critical tech infrastructure. Washington may be the evergreen state, but in the dark it's a dead zone. Number 3. New Jersey. New Jersey doesn't usually make the headlines in blackout warnings, but it should, because it's one of the most overstressed, overbuilt, and dangerously exposed grids in the entire Northeast. First, geography. New Jersey sits smack in the middle of the PJM interconnection, the nation's largest grid operator. That means New Jersey is both a consumer and a conduit. Power flows through it to New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware and Maryland. Lose New Jersey, and you don't just lose Newark. You choke the entire corridor. Peak demand in 2023 soared above 23,000 megawatts, straining a system that's already clogged with aging substations. Much of the infrastructure was built in the 1960s and 70s, and utilities admit replacement rates are decades behind. Then there's the storm risk. Hurricane Sandy in 2012 knocked out power to over 2.6 million customers, some for weeks. A decade later, flood defenses remain patchwork, and substations in low-lying areas are still exposed to storm surge. Add in the growing pressure of data centers. New Jersey has become a major hosting hub for financial servers feeding Wall Street, and you're looking at a grid that can't afford even a flicker. Cybersecurity officials warn that financial systems here are prime targets, meaning a blackout could trigger not just discomfort but global economic panic. And here's the kicker: New Jersey's population density is the highest in the nation, with nearly 1,300 people per square mile. That means when the lights go out, panic spreads instantly, evacuation is impossible, and law enforcement is overwhelmed. In New Jersey, you don't get a blackout, you get gridlock chaos. Number 2. Louisiana. Louisiana lives on borrowed time, and everybody knows it. This is a state where every form of disaster converges: hurricanes, flooding, heat waves, and a crumbling grid that was never designed to withstand them. Hurricane Ida in 2021 knocked out power to over 1.1 million people, including the entire city of New Orleans, for weeks. Transmission towers crumpled like tin foil, and restoration dragged on while residents sweltered in 100 degrees Fahrenheit heat. Louisiana is also among the hottest states in America, with demand for air conditioning spiking past 21,000 megawatts last summer. That wouldn't be catastrophic if Louisiana had a stable grid, but it doesn't. Nearly half of its infrastructure sits in flood-prone areas, and Entergy, the state's main utility, admitted in 2024 that major transmission corridors remain vulnerable to storm surge. Then there's the industrial angle. Louisiana is home to one of the largest petrochemical corridors in the world. That means when the grid fails, it's not just residents in danger. Refineries and chemical plants go dark, risking leaks, explosions and toxic releases. Hospitals in New Orleans have repeatedly had to evacuate patients because backup generators drowned or ran out of fuel during extended outages. And the state's poverty rate compounds the danger. Nearly 20% of Louisiana households can't afford backup generators or emergency supplies. Translation: when the power vanishes, survival is split between the prepared and the desperate. Louisiana isn't just vulnerable to blackouts, it's vulnerable to collapse on every level: human, economic and environmental. Number 1. Tennessee. At the top of this danger list is Tennessee, state that outsiders rarely think about, but insiders fear the most. Why? Because Tennessee is the beating heart of the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, one of the nation's largest public power providers, serving nearly 10 million people across 7 states. That means Tennessee isn't just responsible for itself, it's a grid linchpin. And that's terrifying, because TVA is already stretched to the breaking point. In December 2022, Winter Storm Elliott forced TVA to order rolling blackouts for the first time in its 90-year history. Temperatures plunged, natural gas froze in pipelines, and coal plants couldn't ramp up fast enough. Over 700,000 customers lost power, some in sub-zero conditions, and TVA admitted later it was minutes away from total system collapse. Since then, demand has only grown. Nashville and Chattanooga are booming, new factories and data centers are sucking up power, and TVA itself warned in its 2023 forecast that peak demand could exceed supply margins by 2027. Add in the physical risks. Tennessee sits on the New Madrid seismic zone, which scientists warn could unleash a 7.0 earthquake that would annihilate substations and transmission lines. Meanwhile, severe storms have already shredded the state's infrastructure. Tornadoes in 2020, dereches in 2023, and outages are growing longer and more frequent. Hospitals in Memphis admitted during Elliott that their diesel backups were dangerously close to failing. And here's the brutal truth. When Tennessee goes dark, millions across the South and Midwest go with it. Tennessee isn't just a state at risk, it's the fulcrum of grid survival.